Will China intervene to stop protests in Hong Kong? Beijing warns protesters, saying its patience is wearing thin after many weeks of chaos. But what options does it have to deal with anger in Hong Kong? And is a military intervention possible? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. China has warned it might be losing patience with what it calls a color revolution in Hong Kong. It said those who play with fire must not mistake Beijing's restraint for weakness. They will eventually be punished. A few days after that warning, protesters were back on the streets for the 10th straight weekend. They've defied a police ban on some of the marches and again faced tear gas. Activists have also staged a protest at the international airport to make arriving tourists aware of their campaign. Protesters want Chief Executive Leader Carrie Lam to resign, greater democratic reform, and an inquiry into alleged police violence. But Lam says her priority is to stop the unrest that she says has hurt the city's economy. Al Jazeera's Rob McBride has been covering the protests.
Another day of protests on the streets of Hong Kong and, predictably perhaps, once more ending in violent clashes with the police. This march that we were following started in a district called Sham Shui Po. That's a part of the Kowloon area of Hong Kong where thousands of people took part. Even though it was technically an illegal demonstration, it didn't put people off given the strength of feeling that exists here in Hong Kong at the moment. Once they reached the end of the march, most people simply went home, but a hardcore pressed on and tried to storm Chung Sha Wan police station, which is just a couple of hundred meters down this road here. They formed a barricade, they pushed try to get within throwing range of the walls with police very much barricaded inside. Predictably, a clash broke out. Police fired tear gas and also rubber bullets, dispersing the people who then slipped away. It's part of the protesters' tactics of hit and run. And then very quickly, squads of riot police arrived to very much place their authority once more on the streets of Hong Kong. It does seem to be perhaps a more robust response from the police here. Watching very closely, of course, will be Beijing, and they would applaud such a tough move. They would applaud taking a tougher stance with these demonstrators that we've probably seen today. As we know from remarks that the Chinese central government has made, Hong Kong very quickly is almost reaching a point of no return, is almost on a knife edge, as people here have said, that this whole system of one country, two systems is possibly in danger of collapse, which could, of course, mean eventually having to declare a state of emergency and sending in the People's Liberation Army. We are nowhere near that at this stage, but China is watching very carefully. Rob McBride for Inside Story.
This is what the director of the Hong Kong and Macau Affairs Office, Zhang Xiaoming, who's a top Chinese official, had to say on Wednesday. The violence is getting more and more intense, impacting an increasingly wide part of the society. It can be said that Hong Kong is facing the most serious situation since its return to China. The movement about the extradition bill has gone bad, and it has the clear characteristics of a color revolution. If the situation in Hong Kong continues to worsen into unrest that the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region government cannot control, the central government will not sit back and do nothing. All right, let's bring in our guests from Hong Kong via Skype. Tom Grundy is editor-in-chief and founder of Hong Kong Free Press, an independent publication. From Beijing, Einar Tangen is China political analyst and advises the Chinese government on economic issues and development. And finally, from Nottingham via Skype, Steve Tsang is director of the China Institute at SOAS University of London. Welcome to the program. Steve, let me start with you. The protests have been evolving. What have you noticed changing in the past week?
Well, the really big development in the last week was the language the Chinese government is using. It is now describing the events in Hong Kong as close to that of a color revolution. Now, that's a very, very important change in language that reflects something very important. To the Chinese Communist Party, color revolutions are ultimately about unseating the party from power in China. And that is something which the party or Xi Jinping absolutely will not tolerate. That is, I think, the single most important development in the last week.
Einar, what does it mean to you in Beijing that China is using this kind of language, that they're describing it as a color revolution?
Well, I think you should look at it as a reaction to what's happening in Hong Kong. I mean, this has morphed from the kind of political theater that somehow this extradition treaty was unfair to Hong Kong to a full-blown cry for a complete democratic system. Universal suffrage. I mean, in essence, this is a direct challenge to the existing basic laws and also to Beijing. So I think they're reacting to that, and they will continue to react if these kind of fringe elements continue to push this idea.
Tom, we've talked about the demands that protesters have put out there. We're talking about a complete withdrawal of this extradition bill, an independent inquiry into the crisis, an investigation into what they say is an excessive use of force by police, and also for Hong Kong's Chief Executive Carrie Lam to step down. If one or two of these demands are met, would that put an end to the protests?
I'm sure that Hong Kong could not make any such concessions because it would mean that protests work. But unlike what Mr. Tang was just saying there, universal suffrage is actually something baked into the mini constitution here, the basic law. One of the articles says, I have it right here, that the ultimate aim is the selection of the chief executive by universal suffrage. So this idea of a color revolution, people are not fighting for something new. From what we've been seeing and who we've been speaking to on the streets, they're defending the freedoms and the civil liberties that were promised to them anyway. In many ways, with the demands that you have listed there, they are conservatives because they simply want the freedoms that were promised in the basic law and the one country, two systems agreement to be maintained.
Einar, it looked like you wanted to jump in, so I'm gonna let you have your reaction. But also, I want to ask you about a development that's come about in the past couple of days, where communist-backed publications are essentially accusing the U.S. of being involved in these protests. What kind of direction does this move all of this into?
Well, quite frankly, from Beijing's point of view, the meetings by a senior Democratic Party founder, Mr. Liu, going to Washington, meeting with Pompeo, with Pence, and also Bolton, and in addition to Congress, and seeking support for an independent democratic Hong Kong. And then this latest meeting between a senior embassy official and Mr. Wang, the student leader, has made it very clear, at least in Beijing's eyes, that the U.S. is supporting this particular action. And they believe it's part of a kind of all-pressure situation that, in addition to the trade issue, in addition to sending ships through the Taiwan Straits, that this is another tactic and that the U.S. doesn't care what happens to Hong Kong, only if they can use this as a pawn in a game to gain economic advantage.
Steve, it looked like you were reacting to some of what Einar had to say there, so I want to see if you want to jump in. And I also want to ask you, what do you think about these accusations by China or by communist-backed publications that are essentially alleging that the U.S. is also involved, that there are foreign influences involved in these protests as well?
Well, if I were the director of the CIA, I would be very pleased with what the Chinese government was saying, because it would say that the CIA is delivering miracles that the CIA is totally and utterly incapable of delivering. I think all these allegations of American and other foreign interference are completely groundless. There is a protest that is very much developing out of Hong Kong because of the way how both the Special Administrative Region government and the Chinese government have been dealing with people in Hong Kong. But having said that, I think we do have to take the Chinese government's, albeit mistaken view of foreign intervention seriously. We have to be aware that policies are never made on the basis of reality, but on the basis of one's perceptions and analysis of the reality. They see a lot of shadows behind Hong Kong, black hands in their language, when there really isn't any black hand. And this is a very important issue because it means that the Chinese government is not understanding where the problem really lies in Hong Kong. In a mirror situation, the protesters in Hong Kong are also not seeing what the Chinese government may actually do in response to what they are doing, even though they are not pushing for full-scale democracy at this stage. Their demands are still very much focused on the issue of the laws that have to be withdrawn, that the protesters who are arrested should be free, and a judge-led inquiry should be instituted. They are not really the kind of things the Chinese government are saying about a color revolution. But if Beijing sees it, they have a problem. Both sides need to understand each other in order to find a way out. At the moment, we are not seeing that happening.
Tom, having listened to what Steve just said, do you believe that Beijing, no matter what their rhetoric might be, no matter what moves they've made, do you believe that Beijing really understands what lies at the heart of these protests and these demands from protesters?
Well, I don't think it's coming from abroad. I think those theories are wacky at best and wildly conspiratorial at worst. Looking at some of the videos and things put out by state media, it's quite comical. There is just no evidence for it. Meetings with officials by consulates and others abroad are pretty normal, including meeting those of the opposition. I've seen videos of Caucasians who are present at these protests, and we know a lot of them as journalists or local residents. And most comically, we've seen local lawmakers point to some of the gear protesters are using, like wok lids or swimming floats or laser pens and gas masks. These things are available freely. Here, I don't think the CIA has much of a budget if that's what they're furnishing the protesters with. The fact is, this is an organic, homegrown movement that has come out of years of frustration whereby peaceful protests have not worked, through decades of demands for universal suffrage. And to suggest that it's coming from elsewhere is kind of Orientalist, to suggest that people cannot have independent thought here or organize themselves or purchase face masks without the help of foreigners.
Einar, we're hearing more and more warnings from China, and it seems to be indicating that Beijing's patience is wearing ever thinner. So what exactly is China prepared to do